Hi, my name is Robert Stack, and I'd like to take this opportunity to talk to you about grief. Um, when I first started working at the Brattleboro Retreat 27 years ago, I worked on a rehabilitation unit, and one of the things I did was I was assigned to work in a grief group with Don Annis, who was one of our psychologists who worked at the retreat. This man was like a mentor to me, was at the retreat for 35 years. And every Tuesday and Thursday we would do a grief group. The purpose behind this group was there had been some research that indicated one of the reasons for relapse in the first year of people's recovery from addiction and alcoholism was an issue referred to as unresolved grief. And the idea was that for some people, they were stuck in their grief, and the way that they dealt with their grief was through the use of substances. And so we did this group as part of relapse prevention. That was my introduction to it. It was an amazing experience for me, and from that time I've gone on and taken many courses, a lot of workshops, many books on grief counseling. And my purpose for doing this is that not only do I feel that there are people who are suffering, but also that one of the purposes of working through your grief is that it allows you to open up again. People with unresolved grief sometimes are sort of worried about getting hurt again or experiencing their feelings, and so they, for a variety of reasons, they try to live with it without talking about it or without showing it, and it has a very effect on their emotional lives. So anyway, so just to sort of start at the beginning, in the late 20th century, a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book or a paper on death and dying, and she worked on a cancer unit in the hospital, and she identified 5 stages of grief. These are denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. Now, her study was originally done with cancer patients, and it was a very sort of snapshot, if you will, of certain people at a certain time in their life, and she observed how they went through these stages and what was different about them and what did it mean. And then began to give lectures and talks, and it became almost part of the popular culture, if you will. And now it's at a point now where many people are sort of acquainted with these words and know of the words. But I think, you know, it's worth sort of going back and looking at them again. I like to just give you a framework, a way of thinking about this. I'll talk about a couple other practitioners, but let me just start with her out of respect and reverence. Again, the denial is a denial of this can't be, it's not happening to me. Sometimes when I'll talk about this later, that there are many types of losses. In this case, it had to do with the loss of sense of health. To be informed that you had cancer back then was almost like a death sentence, almost like what AIDS was like 10 years ago. Or, you know, it was sort of like, oh my God, I'm going to die, I have cancer. So a lot of people, the very first thing that you have to do with grief is you have to acknowledge it. You have to sort of say, but you know, you're in shock almost. You don't want to believe it. You know, if someone calls up and says something happened to a loved one, I mean, your first response is no, it can't be. Don't say it. You know, and some people believe that's actually good for the body to be able to protect itself. It's some people say shock. I don't understand that quite, but the idea of being in denial is in some ways very useful. I know we sort of talk about it in a different context in addiction, but denial is a defense mechanism, and it can be useful in some, you know, in the immediate moment. The next stage, and I get these backwards or I flip them sometimes, but bargaining and anger. So sometimes you'll see people bargain first, and they want to make believe it's a mistake, or this can't be, or maybe it's something else, and the wrong test, or something was wrong, or maybe there's a mistake, and of course, you know, the bargaining fails, and it becomes a reality, and when it becomes a reality, people get angry, they get frustrated, and you know, like when someone's in pain, if you've ever seen a little child, when you take something away from them, they get angry, you know, and they stamp their feet, and, you know, it's kind of cute, but it's not very cute when it's adults. But sometimes we get so angry, we get, you know, upset that this could happen to us. It's like we've been wounded, we've been hurt. And that, you know, this is when people get angry at God, or they get angry at other people, they get angry at who they think is the cause or something, you know, and it gets very frustrating, and almost invariably. And you don't hear this anymore because now we think of depression as a chemical imbalance or serotonin uptake and all this, you know. But under my training with Don Annis, he would often say he suspected that depression was anger turned inward. And many people who were grieving, they would start off with this anger and frustration, but over time it would sort of settle in, if you will. And the anger would gradually become depression. Now you have to be careful. There's normal depression that is sort of like I've lost something and I'm sad and I'm depressed, and it's appropriate. But then there's another depression that is more interior depression. It's not just that my world is darker or black and white or my world is emptier. It's more I'm empty. It's more like I won't have any fun. You've internalized a loss, but in a very kind of negative way. And people will feel very, I mean, Freud wrote about melancholy, and that's like name dropping, but the idea is that, you know, it's a fairly natural response, and I think it's a healing response, though in some folks it can become dangerous, I mean, if they're stuck there. But depression is that, and that's why it's always a good sign, you know, when you're trying to encourage somebody, you know, you say, oh, come on out with us, you know, go out to dinner, you know, and they go, no, I don't want to go, no. And you take them out and finally they go, and they have a moment where they don't think about their loss, or they have a moment where they're happy and they smile. And just that memory that it was possible, that, oh, maybe this could pass, maybe I won't always feel this way, it's very reassuring, it's very comforting. And often the idea is that after you get depressed, at some point it becomes acceptance. Now the way I'm talking about it, it sounds like this occurs over time, and it does. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when she first wrote about it, was sort of condensed. It was a little bit quicker on the unit. But again, it was and acceptance doesn't mean like forgiveness, nor does it mean like, oh, I'm okay with it, you know. It's more like, no, I understand now. I'm not angry at anybody. I'm not depressed. I'm not bargaining with anybody. I understand it. It is it is the reality. And that's obviously a good sign. I mean, when you sort of are living in the moment and you're having a very real emotions. So I want to pay homage to her and just mention that those are sort of, now a lot of people have moved on. There's other ways to grieve. There's many, many books have been written. If there is one objection or comment that I could make, is that it tends to sound as if people are moving in stages, that they're sort of going with stage one, like the Pony Express of feelings, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. And yet it's important to understand that with grief, it's so messy, it's so chaotic. One moment you're in acceptance, the next moment you're back in bargaining, and then, you know, you wake up and you're okay, and then later on you're crying, and you know, it looks like you're at peace with it, and then you're angry at somebody, and you go, oh my goodness, I thought I was done with that, you know. But you'll find, so it's not quite that clear, but there is, I mean, if for any other reason, she really got people to understand that there is this process that we all go through of grieving, and some people call the process of grieving mourning, and that grief is the feeling, and mourning is the process, and I don't know, that sounds a little bit like jargon, but perhaps it's helpful to understand that when people are in mourning, they have all kinds of feelings. They get angry, they get agitated, they get restless, they can't sit still, they have fantasies, they talk to themselves, they talk to the devil. I mean, there's all kinds of things that people do in mourning. And mourning is it's a period of time, if you will, and whereas grief is the emotions, the feelings, and so I guess on some level, when you think about Kubler-Ross, you want to understand it from a clinician's point of view, but also from the layperson's point of view, is to recognize and understand that all these things that you hear from people or you see them do after a tragedy, I mean, it's all I mean, it's all this process of grieving. I mean, I really hate it when people get interviewed 24 hours after a tragedy and people put microphones in their face and say, what do you think it is, or what's your reaction? I mean, that's almost unfair. I mean, it's just, you know, I guess it's human interest, but it's not, I don't think it's very helpful. So, when we talk about grieving, when we think about it, it's so important to remember that all grief is unique. The grief that you experience has never been experienced by anyone else. And so when people say things like, I know how you feel, people who are grieving just are like dumbfounded that you could say that to them, because your loss is your loss. No one else has ever had your loss. The relationship you have with a loved one, or the relationship that you have with something, is yours alone. And so be very careful about this idea that somehow you're doing grieving not right, or somehow I'm not doing it the way it's supposed to be done. Or maybe I'm not doing it at all, like maybe there's something wrong with me. I mean, you want to be really careful about that. The way that you're grieving is fine. It's the way you're doing it. Don't worry about it. I mean, you know, come talk to me or talk to another therapist if a year goes by or 6 months and, you know, you find you're still having a hard time. But early on, grief is just grief, and you're probably using all your tools, everything that you have at your disposal to deal with it. Some people who can read, read. Some people who can talk, talk. Some people who can cry, cry. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would just let it happen. Now, I want to mention that most of my work has been with something that they refer to as complicated mourning, unresolved grief. And I'll say more about that as I go on, but I just wanted to point that out, that, you know, grieving is a natural process, and please don't be ashamed of it. Don't feel guilty about the way you're grieving or your thoughts or your actions. Pay attention to them, but recognize that you're probably doing the best you can with them, and that's really all you should think about at that level. I'd like to mention one person. I took a workshop with a guy named William Warden. I spent a week with him down. You know, he's a Harvard professor. There was a tragedy in Boston, and Harvard has an opportunity to study things long term. And so they did this grief study, if you will, over a period of time. I believe it was the Coconut Grove. It was a fire, I believe. And they studied the survivors, and it was a very complicated study, I think. Comprehensive, I should say. And I met William Warden, and, you know, he's a obviously very smart man, and he wrote a handbook. He called it the Handbook of Grief Counseling. And he said that there was 4 tasks in grief counseling, 4 tasks for grieving. And that gives you an idea. Here's this fellow, if you will, who's sort of, you know, a New Englander, you know, and grieving has tasks, you know. So here's these 4 things you need to do. I think for some people that's helpful, because it sounds like, boy, I really want something to do. Somebody tell me what to do. So, and his idea was sort of, first thing you have to do is sort of, you know, accept the loss. You know, understand it. Say it out loud. Use the words. You know, be very careful about euphemisms, like somebody has passed away, or somebody had, you know, you'll hear somebody say, oh, I lost a child or something. Did you misplace them? You know, and I don't mean that like smart. I mean, but sometimes we use words, and then we use them to sort of protect ourselves from reality, but sometimes they're not helpful, because we need to say the words. We need to acknowledge, like if someone's been, like I'll talk a little bit later about the harm that abuse does. And sometimes, you know, people will use other words to describe it. But sometimes you have to call it what it is, and you have to say that so-and-so died, and this happened to me. So that's, I think, in some ways, that's the first task, is to say it out loud, and to, you know, whatever that means, you know, and accept the reality of it occurring. And then the next thing is to sort of express your emotions, is to literally work through the grief. I think when he was thinking about task, he was saying that it takes time, it takes commitment, it takes effort, and you literally work through it. I mean, you literally say, you know, it's been 30 days, it's been 2 months, it's been a year. You know, I've been working through this grief and the memories and the thoughts. And I have to have these feelings. I have to be prepared for moments of sadness and moments of memories and moments of fear even. Sometimes you might even feel a sense of shame. You might even feel a sense of guilt because you're not sad or something else happened. So it's a lot of different feelings. But you just sort of work through it. I mean, in my business we talk about people showing up. And there's an awful lot of showing up in grief. You have to show up, you have to sort of own it, you have to sort of recognize that you have it. And the third thing to do, a task that he would talk about, is that you have to readjust to the new environment. Your world has changed. Things are different. Things are, depending upon the loss, there's the loss, there's life before it and there's the life after it. And you almost have to sort of recognize that things have changed. Emotionally, something has changed in me. Something is different. My exterior world is different. What was there is no longer there, or who was there was no longer there. And you have to understand, and I'll talk more about this in a minute or two, but one of the things that we do sometimes is we develop these stories about things, and sometimes the stories become even more important to us than the reality, and become even more troublesome sometimes. But part of that is recognizing that our lives have changed. Things are different for us. And the last thing to do, on some level, and this some people feel, you have to, he would say you have to relocate the deceased. You have to understand that they're no longer current and they're no longer external, but they become part of you. Now, a lot of people get nervous with that when they think, oh, I never want to forget them, or I don't want to, It's not about forgetting. As a matter of fact, it's maybe the opposite. It's like saying that my grief and my loss has become part of me. But they used to be out there, but now they're within me, and I carry them within me. And this is actually, in some moments, like in the beginning, grief can be so painful and hurt. But over time, you can begin to get these sort of bittersweet moments where it's still sort of bitter, but it's awfully sweet to remember them, and it makes you smile to think of them. And when you think of that transition from being in denial or, oh, I can't believe this has happened, to the real emptiness of feeling like you've lost a part of you, or if you've lost something, like, and it's, we use the expression heartbroken, but your heart's just a muscle. It's really a wound to your spirit, to where you love. And so in time, what was painful and very hard to deal with becomes very sweet, that you have these memories of them, and actually you're actually grateful for those moments, because they remind you that you were loved, or that you did love, and so they really change. So again, when you talk about these kind of things in grief, you expect this to have a change, the things to change, and over time that people will get better and it will change. The next woman I'd like to mention is a woman named Teresa Rando, R-E-N-D-O, and she wrote a very helpful book. I work primarily with psychiatric patients who have substance abuse, or substance abusers who have psychiatric illness. They have something, many of them have something that I would call, and Teresa Rando calls, complicated mourning. Now, complicated mourning means that not only is this natural process of grief, but there's other things involved. There's other characteristics involved. Now, I won't get into the whole theory behind it, but it would be as if you had a relationship with somebody that was sort of conflicted or troublesome, and you lost that person, and you felt like, gee, the argument's is not over. I worked with a client one time that he went to see, his dad was an alcoholic, was sort of abusive, and he went to see him at his death. He asked to talk to his son, and his son thought it was going to be a moment of tenderness, of I love you, and forgiveness. And instead, his father, at the last moment, again, sort of criticized him and, made negative statements about him and died. And so here's this man that he loved, but was very angry at him and very upset with him. And also realized that he was sort of upset that he died before he said, I'm sorry. And he died before he said, I love you. And so not only did he have the grief of losing his father, but he also had this sort of anger and rage that had to do with something else. And so, I mean, I don't mean to make this complicated, but in other words, some mourning is not as easy as other ones. Sometimes you have losses that are so severe. Let me say, not all losses have to be fatalities. Not all of them have to be someone dying. Sometimes we have losses of self-safety. Sometimes we have losses of who we believe we are. Sometimes we have losses that are not sanctioned by society. It's not something that we talk about, but nonetheless, we have them. Like sometimes we know women will lose a child, will make a decision about a birth, and yet they don't forget. They sort of remember. They know how old the child would be. It's not something you would talk about. It might be something that, is part of your life. You might have been abused. You might have been mistreated at a certain time in your life. And that loss of sense of safety, before that you don't really remember your life too much, but you know that it was happy and you were joyous. And then there was this trauma or something happened, and your whole life changed, and everything changed. It was almost as if there was life before the trauma, and then there was life after the trauma. But for whatever reason, you weren't allowed to talk about it, or you weren't allowed to express it. And so, not being able to sort of go through the normal process of grieving, you sort of got stuck in your grief. With some of the clients that I worked with, I used to call it unresolved grief. And by that, I was using a term in grief work they sometimes refer to resolution. In other words, somebody has worked through the process and they have resolved it. And for some folks that I've worked with, they really have gotten stuck in their grief. And this is old stuff. This is stuff that it would not be unusual to hear a client say, I have that buried, or I have that stuffed. This would be the kind of thing that somebody would avoid talking about it, not wanting to talk about it. I guess I wanted to mention Teresa Randua. I mentioned her earlier, and I won't go through it. She had these different stages that she would talk about. But there is one important thing that is so important around some of her work was not only to recognize the loss and not only to experience it and to talk about the feelings, tell the story of it. But one of the things that you have to be aware about with unresolved grief is that, like I said earlier, sometimes people will protect themselves, will keep it hidden, will keep it within them. It may not even be voluntary. In other words, they may not even have access to their feelings and emotions. You could send them to grief group or therapy, and they'd still not do very well with it. Some of the clients I work with, the only time they allowed themselves to show their feelings or emotions is when they were drinking. It's as if the governor would be taken off and they could express and go to their rage and their anger and tell their story to strangers, to bartenders, go to it. The problem with that is they never really worked through it. They would just visit it from time to time. If you have unresolved grief, your loved ones know about it, because I bet from time to time you bring it up and you experience your anger and your sadness, or you talk about it. And your loved ones and people around you might say, why don't you talk to somebody? Why don't you go talk to somebody? And you go, no, I don't, there's this terrible moment when you're afraid of some feelings that you have within you. It would be okay to be afraid of things on the outside. But when you have emotions and feelings within you that you're afraid of, you spend a lot of time trying not to show them. You spend a lot of effort in repressing them and not showing them and letting them come out. And one of the nice things, and the reason I want to finish up with this, is that Teresa Randall really makes the point that one of the things that's successful about grief and working through your grief and allowing yourself to have it, to show it, is that it will allow you to love again. It will allow you to open up again. Because many people with unresolved grief will bring people into their lives, but they'll keep people away because they're a little bit afraid of getting hurt again. Now that's okay in the beginning, and that's, human nature perhaps. But it's as time goes by and you realize that you're still afraid. And, fear is this terrible thing that we have. So I guess I just want to encourage people, is that there are feelings and emotions, and don't be afraid of them. And we have a lot of therapists and counselors and people in the community. We have pastoral counseling. But mostly all you need from someone is someone to listen to you. A successful grief is someone that listens to you. Actively listens to you. And that you have this moment to share and talk about how you feel and what it's meant to you and how it's changed your life. And tell the story of your grief. And perhaps if at some moment you can understand that this grief has become part of you, and it's part of it. Perhaps you've been scarred, but you can heal, and it is part of who you are, and it becomes part of your emotional life. It becomes part of your spiritual life, and you're not afraid of it. Matter of fact, you at some point, like I said earlier, you even embrace it and understand that for most people, grief is about love, and it's the acknowledgement of loss of love, and it can be very healing to experience it. I hope this has been helpful to you in some way. There's a lot more to say about it, but I just wanted to offer this to you at this time. Thank you.